As the day is getting close to an end, as we heard about an extremely, speak louder, as we heard about an extremely ambitious scientific endeavor, as we are still trying to grasp some of its near and long-term implications, let me take a few minutes to describe the landscape and the importance of this discussion and make some bridges with what happened at noon. So science and technology not only improve our lives, but shapes our expectations and eventually our experiences of how lives ought to be lived. In this respect, science and technology govern lives. They cannot be separated from the transformative power they encapsulate. Knowledge is power. Knowledge is responsibility. And I think this is where this journey begins, with notions of what we know and what we do not know yet. So before beginning to talk about social acceptance, public engagement, public discussion, global consensus, before deciding whose voices will be heard, citizens, lawyers, ethicists, and how inclusive this process will be, we owe to ourselves to interrogate what this journey is about, what this research is really about. And at first glance, there is something deeply interesting about this quest to better understand the fundamental biological processes behind the human genome. You actually need a lot of humility to be able to understand and accommodate the biological and cellular substrate. But while this quest is fascinating, we deserve to interrogate a few tensions. And the first tension is about knowledge and responsibility, or in other words, as Ken was saying, uncertainty and control. And I'm not sure we can talk about tangible risks and benefits at this point without going to mere speculation. So some of my epistemic questions, and I give you that as food for thought, are: when does a source of uncertainty become clearly a risk in the eye of the bioengineer? And is he the only one to make that call? So which expertise, whose knowledge will be influencing the framing of scientific and moral uncertainty surrounding new genomic systems? To what extent can we reduce complexity, and what are we losing when doing so? How do we create a collective capacity to be reflexive about those unknowns, uncertainties, and issues of containment and control? How good are we at computing and simulation models when we do safety assessment? So these are a few questions that we will be confronted with in the lab. Then when and if this project is being discussed outside of the lab, by investors, policymakers, citizens, what is to be expected? There will be an array of other tensions. And the first one is about hype and disillusions. So too often we forget the complexities of biomedicine in practice. There will be, I think, a constant need to reassess, re-explain what the added value is of producing new genomic systems and how this is a tangible path towards biomedical progress. I'm not questioning this necessarily, but that's going to be a reassessment that will be expected of you, I think. Hype is dangerous because it widens the gap between scientific realities and the expectations of policymakers, funders, and citizens. So while I don't think it makes sense to interrogate issues of disparity, equity at this point, we would have access to what benefits. We don't know what those benefits are necessarily. The question of how, in a democracy, we allocate research funding to a new venture like this one, that's a democratic question. That's an equity question that we need to be thinking about. Yet the most significant tension might be about openness. So how open, transparent does this project ought to be? And openness means a lot of things, but it's also linked to public trust. So what part of the project could be open source? What's going to lead to some form of commodification or IP? What notion of fairness and benefit sharing will be at its core? We know we all share the genome. It's basically not the property of science alone, or not the property of a nation or a culture. Then finally, how open will this project be to societal concerns and deliberation? We often think that public opposition comes from technical misunderstanding. It does sometimes, but it also reflects, other conceptions of how we should live well with emerging technologies. So we definitely need to anticipate the societal implications to be able to produce those meaningful conversations that could guide this research and its agenda. And then the last question remains, and that's something, you know, our democracy have not really solved, but how do we develop an ethos of inclusive public deliberation and public decision making that could guide this research agenda? So our panelists will help us with those questions, I hope. And I'm just going to give a quick personal introduction. So Jeantine represents the philosophical tradition scholarship. She works in George's lab. Barbara is a recognized professor and expert in legal and ethical questions surrounding genomics. Nicole, you have heard her before. She's with the NIH, with the program actually dealing with the human genome, and she's a program director in ethics and legal issues. And Matthew is our practitioner. He's an oncologist, hematologist, and an expert in genome editing and stem cell transplantation. So do you want to go first, Jeantine?
Yeah, that's fine. So our first charge originally was to comment upon the 1% project. And I must say, even that I'm since long time lab-based, I really feel like, you know, whether I'm a juror of figure skating, being not a figure skater myself, because this is really hard to make, in particular, moral statements about the scientific, very short-phrased sub-projects that have been proposed. So that's sort of the caveat. If we need to make a choice, if that would be the case, that we would need to make a choice, one or the other, or the order of subscale projects, I think we need to rely rather on at the first place on balancing what is going to be the gain of knowledge from a particular project, and then very clearly what are the biosafety aspects, what are the biosecurity aspects, how do those three components relate to each other, because what is going to be the price in terms of biosafety or biosecurity of a high gain in knowledge, and if we do not expect a real innovative step forward, even if it is, say, a low-risk project, should we pursue it, should we invest in it? But that's not typical questions that philosophers or ethicists can answer on their own. So we'll be happy to advise. Sitting in around with people who present the arguments and explain to me what's going on, because I think before saying anything in the area of like ELSI, one really needs to know the subject matter with a multiplicity of voices. So one other question that's of course logical, and I heard it a bit like, well, should we maybe go for the low-hanging fruit? So what would be the low-hanging fruit? And we have a tendency to think, well, that's like concrete things, like the animal organs, preparing the animal organs, or animals to have their organs more suitable for human transplantation. Yeah, there might be a way to go. It's already underway because our lab, and we heard Luhan, is working on those technologies. So it's there. I think and we should be aware, with or without this overarching project. But this overarching project adds a unique extra opportunity to go just a step further. So we should use the chances that a consortium would offer. On the far end, as I may have understood it, either correctly or not, the prototrophic humans, are there concerns with it? Should we go for it? Should we prioritize it? I wouldn't dare to give a judgment right now. I would really need to look at it in depth with the people involved. And we always need to make differentiate between moral and prudential considerations. Prudence can instruct is to do or not to do certain things, but prudence should not be confused with morality and ethics and the highest values we all can imagine. It's a very fine line, and it can be very dangerous because it's extremely compelling in public. And of course, a big question is what difference makes human? Well, I'll be very honest and give you my personal opinion, and it's based on a personal value statement. I think it does not make that difference. We are all animals, and I would give us an advice, and it's a bit what you said, openness, and what I've advocated before, veracity. Please be clear and open. The human system will be the system worked on sooner or later, and you better say it up front, because otherwise the damage that you've done by trying to hide it a bit, to put a veil over it, that is going to be hard to repair. So what I would want to suggest would be another subscale project, and that would be it would be a research project into the humanities. That is not an ethics committee, it's not the ethics police, whatever. It's really research into the humanities. Of course, very selfishly, it's a philosophical inquiries in the first place, but also, of course, all those questions beyond, and that will include other, say, humanities disciplines.
Thank you, Jeantine. I think some of what you said, you know, we shared that thought before. It's really difficult to figure out what's part of fundamental, basic research here, and what can be linked to promises, claims, and I think, Matthew, you can probably enlighten us on, on that.
Not sure. So first of all, thank you for the invitation to come. And actually, it's exciting to be in a room full of scientific and engineering optimists. Jeff earlier in the day said he was a cynic, but I think the proposal he's making about what he wants to do shows he's not a cynic, he's an optimist, because what's being proposed here is quite ambitious. And to start with, I think we want to think about, are we all intrigued about this project because of the engineering challenges? Can we do this? Can we simply figure out how to do this? And I think the answer is yes. I mean, I'm sitting here in my head all day thinking, well, could we go about this way? Could we go about that way? How could we make it happen? And I think that's one set of questions we have to think about, is how much is this driven just by our drive to be able to tinker and fix and play? I think but that leads to a second question, which is how do we, once we're able to do it, how do we want to apply it? Do we want to apply it to answer questions? Do we want to apply it to develop new therapeutics? And now what comes to mind is who gets to decide how we'll use these technologies? What questions are we going to try to answer as we're developing these, what are going to be really cool engineering tools, and not only to be able to synthesize long stretches of DNA in vitro, but to be able to then introduce them in a precise fashion into the human genome. I think that actually there is regulatory protections against that are intact about if you engineered a human ES or iPS cell, that's not going to generate a human. There's stem cell committees have dealt with that. But I think showing that you're thinking about it and you building in safeguards, I think is going to be good. But then what biologic questions should we try to answer? And I think we've heard today some opinions about what they think would be important to answer. In engineering cells that are resistant to viruses, engineering human cells that aren't dependent on certain metabolites or amino acids. And those questions are driven by our individual biases and histories and backgrounds. And I'm not sure that those questions should be solely determined by the power brokers in the field. It may be that other communities have questions that they're more interested in that should be listened to. And then as I started listening to the pilot projects, I'm going to sort of move from the ones that I think are sort of less bioethically or raise bioethical concerns to ones that are more. So early on it was proposed that this is going to be a project only done in cells. And there was one proposal about sort of generating a cell that has all the most common or the ancestral variants of all the SNPs. Which I think is interesting, but I think what's more interesting is not creating a homogeneous genome, but using these new technologies to understand how our diverse genomes, why they evolve. I'm particularly interested in sickle cell disease. And so there's a sickle variant, and I don't call it a mutation because, as many of you know, in the heterozygous state, that variant gives you an advantage in a certain environmental background. And so I think we have to be really careful about using words to connotate better or worse genomes, purer or less pure genomes. And I think what this project is about is saying we have the tools now to explore how these variants impact. And so I was thinking as I was listening to haplotype human ES cells or other things, is now you challenge those cells under different environmental conditions, just as was sort of discussed with yeast, to figure out, oh, this set of variants gives an advantage, creates a neuron with these sort of phenotypes, but creates a heart with that sort of electrical phenotype, whereas this sort of variant does that. And so I think what's exciting is not to say what's pure and perfect, but instead to use the tools to understand why we're different. And so I think framing it that way will be really powerful and I think more scientifically interesting. Then I think we got into the idea of engineering, using some of the tools to engineer organ pigs so that they could be transplanted into humans. And I think we're all comfortable eating, well, not everyone in the room, much of the world is not comfortable with eating pigs, but most of the world is comfortable with eating animals. But I still think that there is, and I'm not going to give an answer, but I think there is a degree of uncomfortableness, both well-grounded in religious reasons, philosophical reasons, and sometimes just yuck reasons, about thinking about creating a human-animal chimera, an organ chimera, in which you have cells from one species in another species. And I work right down the hall from Hiro Nakauchi, who's creating these chimeras. And it's exciting work, but no doubt it makes people pause. And I think that we should respect that. In that yuck factor or the more formal ethical reasons why you wouldn't want to do that. But that now starts to, are we distracting from the project by conflating with a very specific thing that the engineering pigs to be organ donors isn't necessarily the only application you would do with this. And do we potentially contaminate the entire project by proposing something that many people in the world would find sort of untenable? And I think we have to be careful of that. And then the final sort of thing that actually two more things, is creating the prototroph human cell. I think from a scientific an engineering perspective, it's fascinating. And as I was listening to it, I'm going, well, if you there's metabolic cycles, and we know we need to cycle glucose down into this pathway in order to rescue these amino acids. And now if you have to synthesize more amino acids, what's going to happen to glycolytic fluxes and TCA cycles? And there's a whole bunch of sort of metabolic questions you can answer by perturbing that system, which I think should be good enough, without trying to propose that this is going to be a way of solving world hunger. Because I'm not sure it's going to solve world hunger. We may just substitute eating complex plants for generating more high fructose corn syrup to supply the energy necessary for us to synthesize. So I'm not sure we even know. And the last point I want to make, and I've probably gone on too long, is it came up at the lunch conversation a little bit, is a synthesized human genome a human genome? And I guess I was taking it one step further and thinking about, if we use, say, tools like CRISPR to start deleting parts of the genome. So we create a human genome that's like the yeast genome, which is 20% smaller. Is it human? I mean, we know the chimpanzee genome and our genome is 99% identical. If we now make a human genome that's actually more diverse than a chimpanzee genome, are we now actually dealing with a human genome or some sort of new species genome? And how do we define what it means to be human? Now, I agree we're all animals, but I also think, sorry, I'm speciesist a little bit, that there is something special, or we need to acknowledge that for many of us, there is something about being human and how we define humanness. Now, I personally believe that we're not who we are because of the sequence of our DNA. But on the other hand, I think that's a part of who we are. And so I will stop there and pass it along.
I did not. I meant that in another way, namely that working in other organisms, and particularly animals and mammals, you will end up, this is going to lead into humans.
Right.
And then we ask questions. But
okay, so yeah, and I was talking more to what does it mean to be human, and how much is that defined by a 3 billion base pair sequence versus a 2.7 billion or a 2.5 billion sequence, and diploid versus haploid.
I'm Barbara Evans from the University of Houston Law Center, and I'd like to thank you for having me. when this project becomes publicly announced, I envision there would be a lot of academics thinking, now we'll get the old team together and do another great big ELSI project, an ethical, legal, and social issues project. I think there's a presumption that that project would look a lot like the ELSI studies that accompanied the first Human Genome Project. I would like to press a little and query that. We've heard that the first Human Genome Project was reading the genome, and the second one will be writing the genome. The first round of ELSI projects was very much ethics writing, and I think we need to transfer in this second phase to ethics reading, and I'll explain what that means. It was thought that for scientists to read the human genome would create a lot of risk for individual research subjects and patients, and that these people were vulnerable and scientifically naive and needed top-down protection from experts who would have large public funding to enunciate the standards of protection for them. The problems we face as we start writing the genome, I have not heard anyone here suggesting that we're going to be doing any human subject research or doing anything right away that would affect or put risks on living individuals. And I also, everything I'm hearing described arguably is writing in the sense of First Amendment protection. Some of it is making artistic renditions of human beings and their genomes, which would be pure speech that would be almost unregulable, frankly. It's art. And some of it would be commercial speech when done by a company, which receives significant constitutional protection in that there are boundaries on how it can be regulated. When you take that, I don't think we're going to be so much in an ELSI mode of making standards that we try to translate into law and regulation to impose here. I think we're dealing with issues of moral acceptability to the public, and we're dealing with some issues of risks, which I think will not be so much questions of ethics as they will be questions of scientific risk assessment and legal jurisdiction, which regulations can attach to protect against these risks. So I think the ethics here will be reading the public sentiments, not getting the experts, but reading public sentiment and trying to stay aligned with that. Now, the first round of ELSI projects was very much top-down, expert-oriented ethics. And even with generous funding, two key constituencies never became convinced that the ethics experts were experts. One is the courts. As a lawyer, try getting admissibility of a normative ethicist as an expert witness. It is felt by the courts, there's great controversy in this, that they disagree so much and so profoundly that it's hard to say they're experts at all. And it's very controversial. Now, I can get admissibility of testimony by a descriptive ethicist. You know, if they need someone who has studied how hospitals practice ethics below 20th Street in New York City, and I find you an expert that studied that for 20 years, I can get that person admitted. But admitting someone who's going to tell us what is the morally right thing to do, very hard to get that past a judge and get it admitted. The second key constituency that didn't become convinced was the people, those of us that the ethicists were trying to protect. We were showered with paternalistic protections that weren't necessarily what the people wanted. How much money was spent to protect us from having our own information returned to us, lest we should have psychosocial harms and these things. Also, surveys show that 80% of people are very kind of favorably inclined toward the idea of contributing their health data for use in research, but they don't do it because the ethics and privacy standards that got enunciated top-down for us aren't what we wanted. We wanted to maybe do collective bargaining and negotiate for our own ethical standards, and that wasn't the plan. So the experts here are likely to be the people. The normative ethics of this even though we're scientifically naive, that doesn't mean we're ethically naive. I've worked all over the world, and some of the most ethically savvy people I ever met were peasants. Another big issue here I just want to point out is there is a question of ripeness. That's a legal concept that the bioethics community hasn't embraced. The notion of ripeness is there is a proper time when an issue is ready to be litigated or debated. I can envision a situation, for example, if you have a bunch of people sitting around in ancient Mesopotamia developing cuneiform script. That's not the time that we need to debate that someday that script may be used to write pornography. You don't think of what could happen 500 years from now and debate that now. I think we need to be having boundaries carefully defined on what gets done here and make it very clear we're not going to use our artistic expression to create people who look like Pablo Picasso, with an eye up here. We're going to have boundaries and just do things and keep some of these far-flung issues from being ripe for debate now through careful tailoring. If I can take one more minute, I think it's very important that at this point it is time to expect evidence-based bioethics. We've had great progress in medical science through evidence-based medicine. I think those who want to say there's a benefit or a risk need to state what is their assumption they're making. And I know how hard it is to predict benefits and risk. So let's do post-marketing surveillance on these claims, just as we do with drug claims. Let's have each person disclose what assumptions are being made about risks, and let's track them and see which ones come to be true so that we get to a more evidence-based discourse about risks. Many of the issues here are just straight legal issues. If you have a group of people that are going to share data, how do you avoid transgressing antitrust law by excluding other people? Those, I think, are the easy ones. But we need a transition to citizen bioethics and do-it-yourself bioethics. And the way to facilitate that may be through crowdfunding of ethics. Let's see what people are willing to fund. Maybe have some contests, like the MIT contest. Let's have amateur ethicists analyze some of these problems and use that as a learning device. I think we could do a much better job really engaging the deep reservoir of ethical sensibility that exists in ordinary people.
We don't leave that to Nicole. Do you still want to contribute?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I'm still Nicole Walker and still speaking only for myself and not any other acronym. And this is a perfect follow-on from Barbara. I would agree that with a project like this, it's important to incorporate both ethical and regulatory experience into the project team, but also to think about that research and to think about research from a diverse perspective and what kind of research on ethical and legal issues is needed by the project. Is it something where maybe embedded or integrated study makes sense? Is it something where having independent research makes sense? Looking at empirical research, as you pointed out, certainly the research that has showed people want their results, but it's funded by ELSI. So looking at a lot of different research models, different ways of engaging the public and studying what the public thinks. There are a lot of different techniques we can use, all the way from philosophers who can answer some questions. We can decide whether we want to agree with them or not, all the way to your typical surveys, focus groups, as well as more deliberative democracy kinds of things. If we explain the project to people, what do they think about it? Especially in a field like this where people may not have an intrinsic understanding of the project and its implications. They might need some help thinking about it, some description of risks and benefits, recognizing that those are going to change. So I think, thinking both about issues that could use further study, but then also about the methods and models that would make the most sense. And as this goes forward, I think it's also worth considering how these issues should be dealt with across projects. Will there be kind of fundamental principles that will be adhered to? So if you think back to this morning and the synthetic yeast project, they had kind of 11 principles everyone agreed to. Would that kind of model make sense, a foundation? Or would it be something where maybe you'd want to try out different models? You know, this project is going to kind of use this model and explore, and this other project is going to use something else, and we're going to compare, or we're going to evaluate over time. And again, I think this is something that where you would want to revisit whatever policies, procedures, governance. How does that work going forward? Whatever the project turns out to be, where are you in a few years? What have you learned? What makes sense to do now? Especially if this is just a pilot. What do you learn from the pilot, and how do you want to move forward?
Great, thank you so much. We're going to open to questions from the audience. I don't know if you still have some question after this lunch.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting session. And one thing that has been going through my head a lot is that if we're going to engage the public as the source of the ethical framework, to not be in an ivory tower, that's going to require a lot of education. And so that's something that we haven't talked about explicitly a lot. It seems that there should be a fairly concerted educational effort if we're going to engage the public in this way. So I wanted to ask about that, I guess.
You want to, or you actually have it?
I should comment on it. I think it does require public education, and how best to do that is always the question. I think, though, it's important to realize when I say engaging the public in setting ethical standards, I don't necessarily mean they would set the regulatory and legal standards, because we have a political process that does that already. So ethics in law became very conflated in the first ELSI project. They're actually separate things, and I think we don't have to achieve consensus among all members of society for their input to be meaningful. It's pluralistic, and we just need to recognize and be aware and have them informed, as you say.
Perhaps if I could clarify a little bit with one other thought. So just to clarify, the reason I'm thinking about education being a crucial component for getting a real feeling for how people feel is that it depends a lot on how you ask a question, and it depends a lot on whether people understand the question that you're asking as to the response you're going to get, especially when there are inflammatory voices out there that pose things as black and white and raise the specter of unlikely possibilities. And that's where I think it's not really possible to get a realistic read on how people would really respond to the true technology unless they have a fairly good grounding in what we're talking about, and unless the question is posed in a neutral way. And so those are the kind of things that are going through my head.
This is the sort of empirical work that you were suggesting.
Yeah, and there are you're absolutely correct. That needs to be done very carefully. You can get whatever answer you're looking for based on the stem of the question, right? If you present it as extremely risky, you will get a much different reaction from at least a lot of people than if you present all the wonderful benefits and curing of sick children. You will get a much different response. So, but there are means of doing this, and so it's certainly something that can be done. I think part of it depends on the extent of that consultation that you're looking to do. Are you looking to just get maybe a read on a particular community that you think might be impacted, or you're trying to get kind of a representative sample? But it's certainly, in my mind, it would be difficult to do, let's mail 10,000 surveys and see what people say. You could certainly have, a text in there that describes the projects, but at least at the beginning, it might be something where you need to invest more time or use a method where you'd have that space to explain the complex science and the rationale and benefit that could emerge.
Yeah, something you will be accountable for. It's really, showing that you measure the uncertainty and the complexity, and that you can frame that as the project is going forward. Like, when we interact with, when we do different kind of assessment with the public, they don't want to play the role of the, the person who is going to arbitrate. They measure their own skills and expertise too. But if you can, by the words of a French philosopher, based on Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, he was saying, learn to love your monsters. So if you learn to make something, if you create something, and like we're talking about synthesizing here, be sure you have in place all the ways of doing the assessment, of taking care of that that technology you are building, and show that to the democratic public that's basically listening to you. The reason why the Frankenstein story became such a nightmare, it's because the doctor fled away from the room after electrifying the creature. So it's like there is really something to show there. We have not been that good at anticipating risk and dealing with uncertainty. So.
It's always very humbling listening to such an articulate panel. I'm just a mere scientist. It's beautifully put. Could I just ask a question about ownership? So who would own a synthesized human genome?
Sounds like a legal question to me.
Well, it's a legal question, but it's furthermore an intellectual property law question. We've had recent cases that suggest that naturally occurring gene sequences are not patentable, but this would in essence be made by man or made by woman and should be patentable. I would say we have some people in the audience who are specialized in IP law, and as I am a biotech lawyer working the FDA and data privacy side, I would defer to some of these other voices.
Technically, but I meant more about the public. If you're presenting this project as the Human Genome Sequence Project, all the information is available to everyone on the planet. If they've got an internet, if they can get on the internet and get the information, who would own this constructed genome?
Well, I'm not sure of that. There are some biosecurity issues that I'm not sure we do put all of this out there for anyone to use. We may want to have qualified recipients that have been vetted. Are there biosecurity issues that would cause the distribution of this knowledge to be restricted?
The synthetic human genome as such, I would not think so. I think some of the recoding techniques that are being worked on already currently, of course, they have biosecurity implications. Because like being able to make anything is wide-ranging in the end.
Minnesota Connect suggests Prince as being the source for the cell lines.
I would say something you should think about. It's definitely benefit sharing, maybe more than, is it in the open for anyone, terrorists or others to, but benefit sharing, it's part of our common heritage. So there is something beautiful to think about. That would be actually a great gift.
So I'll just pick up on Barbara's tip-off here. I'm here today because I am a biotech patent lawyer by training, now in business with a company who independently manages patent pools. And I do a lot of thinking about open source versus patents, who owns things, how do we want to use intellectual property in a responsible way for society. So I have a lot of ideas about structures that this group could work with, some very creative models to go forward and maybe get intellectual property, but figure out how we want to use it in a way that would benefit science and humanity. So come speak to me if you are interested.
But one comment on that is that the SC 2.0 project made it explicit that there wasn't going to be IP followed, and perhaps the model is that the consortium, the project says this is one of the 11, and IP is not going to be part of it. I mean, that could be upfront.
One quick follow-up, I guess,
Yeah.
on the ownership question is I worked on the Myriad case, and if you did synthesize a modified genome, it would immediately be patentable. It would be new, but it wouldn't necessarily be non-obvious. And so you can challenge patents on whether they're new, useful, or non-obvious, and so on. What are called 101 grounds, it would definitely be new. You could even take someone else's genome and methylate it, and it would then be new, even in a new site, based on the patent examiner guidelines that they issued. At any even primer, as long as you add a small methyl group, it's then considered a new product that's not part of a product of nature. So it's a new item. Of course, it might fail on the sort of defense grounds of it's pretty obvious if you just add a methyl group. But in terms of can you patent it, well, you can try and patent almost anything. And so it would win on some grounds, but probably not on the obviousness grounds or what are called 103 grounds. But you could, actually this came up during the break. We were talking about planting other people's genomes to claim it was prior art or try and take someone else's synthesized genome and say, no, I found it over here, therefore it's in nature, to invalidate someone else's patent. And so there might be some weird, nefarious patent things that could happen.
At the same time, under Myriad, the whole idea of granting patents on cDNA, you want to talk about obvious.
Yeah, exactly. We'll challenge it only on 101 grounds.
Right, okay. Shall we move to another question? Okay. It often is really good to move to specific examples to provoke discussion, and I have to tell you, it's been a great panel. But let me give an example and ask some questions around it. It goes back to the morning. And the example is Lujan and George's work on PERVs and transplants. Now, Barbara, you were saying that there are no issues that you see coming that present human subjects issues. Yeah. And you were also talking about how to regulate risk using the model of therapeutics with follow-up. Couple questions on that. First, if you talk about the pig transplantation with PERV knockouts, that does present human subjects issues almost immediately. I'm kind of looking at Matthew and asking how you're going to write the IND on that one. Okay, but what are the issues? So one set of issues, and this really goes to the comments on evidence-based analysis, right? And I actually, well, George and I did a panel on this stuff last winter, and I have to tell you, I almost fell over when he told me about it, and then I've been using it as an example in every talk I give since. And the reactions in the US and Europe from regulators and others have been interesting. So the first set of reactions are in the US, right? We're good libertarians, and we see it strictly in terms of patients. And the argument is, if I need a kidney and I'm about to die, you tell me what the risks are and it's my call. And that's a classic American response. And in fact, if you're about to die, you understand why. And you want as much evidence on risk as possible. But again, given the kidney shortage, you kind of know how that one's going to come out. So I go to Europe, and I explain how us Americans have this really licked, look at this great technology, and here's the way to handle it. And the reaction was immediately, you have the wrong frame. You have the wrong frame because as good as that lab is, boy, are there a lot of PERVs. And there's a possibility of crossing species barrier with a retrovirus. Who knows what happens over the long term? The effects are often lagged. So it's not a subject consent issue. It is an externalities issue with the potential for real difficulty down the line. Then I get back to the US and I'm giving those points. And you run into a guy who's doing what? He's a transplant guy who's running the panel on transplants. And he sits there stone-faced and says, have you ever told someone who needs a kidney that they're going to die? And what evidentiary standards are appropriate? And then we come back to the issue of what information do we need? How should it be gathered? And by the way, once it's done, do you really want to be assuming that there will be follow-up of the quality of what we see in medicine now, or half the time? When people are supposed to be validating biomarkers, they don't follow up. In fact, the follow-up's very, very weak in medicine, and you could argue that there's a moral lapse there as well. The question, what's the right moral frame for analyzing these things? I do think it's coming quicker than you think. And I'm not sure I believe that adaptation and follow-up is the way to go, but what incentives do we have to ensure that people actually behave morally and ethically in doing the follow-ups?
Matthew, do you want to?
Well, I mean, maybe this is a cop-out, but I don't think we have to have a single framework. I think it might be fine that the US develops one set of guidelines around doing, kidney's not the right example because there's dialysis, so you should probably use liver. because we can't do liver replacement therapy. Yeah, but point's taken. So I don't think it's a problem to think that we might have different regulatory frameworks in one cultural setting and different regulatory frameworks in different cultural setting, because I don't think it would be necessarily appropriate for a Catholic Anglo-Saxon viewpoint of the world to impose itself on a Islamic viewpoint of the world that would impose itself on a Han Chinese viewpoint of the world. What?
But the retrovirus.
Yeah, so you're.
Is an externality, so it's really not an individual consent issue.
Yeah.
No, I agree with the idea that it would be wrong to have just a single framework. Consent is appropriate when people are taking on risks to themselves, but it is not appropriate for consenting to risk to others. And some technologies may present risk not just to the patient, but to the patient's family or to surrounding people, and it becomes an environmental problem at that point more than a consumer safety problem.
Antibiotics
Right.
fall in that same class.
Exactly.
There's no new technology here, or not taking the
Right.
vaccine.
And the difficulty has been that it slips through these jurisdictional boundaries. The antibiotic resistance problem, FDA looks at it and says, where does that fit? They're trying, but it's more of a sort of global environmental problem, and yet EPA looks at it and says that's drugs. It's hard, we don't have the laws to capture these, and an issue here, we may finally need some new statutes to create the right set of authorities to bring it all together into a single point of oversight.
I think that is one of the topics that is going to be addressed in the revision of the coordinated framework, because this is a clear example of how that is meanwhile deficient after 30 years, because nobody has ever thought of this becoming a reality.
I'm going to take the two last questions and then let Nancy take the floor.
The issue of evidence-based medicine is a good example. If you read enough guidances, you'll notice that a lot of them are level C, which is expert opinion. And I think we're going to end up with a lot of level Cs in this area. And this is a general issue for science. I don't think this is just an issue for this particular proposal. I mean, I think in general, issues of risk, benefit, uncertainty, and evidence-based decisions about that are important. The question is, how do you do that? And that's what I want the panel to comment on, because in drug development, I mean, the EMA, for example, has hundreds of pages of documents and guidances on how you evaluate benefit and risk. We don't have any guidance at all on how we do that. So I think that is one big issue. I think the other issue is, where do we really go from here? I mean, we aren't going to go synthesize the human genome tomorrow. So are we going to run out and say, hey, we're going to synthesize the human genome and we want to know what you think, but we're not going to do that. We're going to do this instead. So I don't understand what the next steps are. And maybe you can give some comments on that.
Who wants to take the...
Well, I think both as to the benefits and the risks, to some degree, we will be dealing with the limits of what is knowable. And when you're dealing at that limit, where you put the burden of proof can be decisive of whether you go forward or not. And I think we need to be careful. You know, does someone who has a concern need to prove it's dangerous to stop it, or does the person who wants to go forward have to prove it's safe? We need to be very careful about this, because we are dealing with uncertainty where we cannot even necessarily put the probability distribution of various outcomes. I think I disagree somewhat with the statement that we have no framework for dealing with that in our drug regulation. There actually are through the ICH process, FDA has tried to enunciate how we go about these things. In these,
I agree in drugs. I was talking about in science.
in science more generally?
Yes.
Well, can others answer that? I think there will always be things at the frontier of what we know, and we can't design away from that, because you just move the frontier out and get back into uncertainty as you advance. And yet we have to go forward. Are you asking, should we have a precautionary approach?
No, I'm asking, how do we evaluate risk, benefit, uncertainty as a group around this particular project to move forward with?
I think define very carefully what we're doing and what the boundaries are, and the boundaries we will not go beyond, and try to keep that horizon of what we're doing something we can communicate to the public in a sensible way. And what we're not going to do is as important as what we're doing to manage the risk.
That's definitively something we can keep on the agenda to actually answer or work on. The last question, and then.
I want to return to the question about international frameworks and difference of cultures. There's a dark side of that too. We already know that medical technology can be very heavily abused to do things like, female infanticide in the womb. Once we have the ability to readily do some of these editing technologies, I think that unless we have some sort of clear international framework in place, it's going to be a question of where do people do their medical tourism in order to get something that their home country may not approve of. How do we approach a question like that? And should we be concerning ourselves with it in this community, or is that something kicked over to, oh, that's a politician problem?
Well, I mean, I think there is a national and international conversation going around just that issue. And I think the goal of the genome editing community is to come to an international consensus that the stakeholders around the world will agree to abide by. Now, there's going to be no single body that can legislate that and mandate that every country obeys it, but the goal is to develop a consensus around boundaries about where we should go, where we shouldn't go until we learn more, where we might never go. In 2016, in 30 years, as I said, maybe those have to be reevaluated. But that's the goal right now in that conversation.
So does this conversation we're having in the room today change that at all? Or is this just a difference of degree and not of time?
I think it's a difference in degree. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for your expertise. And I give the floor to Nancy.